Okay. First of all, thanks for staying through Sunday morning. I really appreciate it. I've only got 35 minutes, so we're going to dive right in, and you're going to help me answer a question, which is what pieces, if any, did the Earl of Oxford contribute to the Christopher Marlowe canon? Well, Christopher Marlowe had a short career because he got killed before he was 30 years old. Only 13 items have been fully credited to Marlowe. 2 translations, 2 Latin epistles, 2 poems, and 7 plays. There are a couple of other items that are on the fringe. We're not going to have time to talk about those, but we'll focus on the things that people definitely say Marlowe wrote. So we'll start with the first 2, translations. And what we're looking for now is any hint that the Earl of Oxford might be involved. If we don't see it, we just move on. The first translation he did was called All Ovid's Elegies. It closely follows the original Latin, and that's very important because I think when Edward de Vere did translations, such as his uncle Arthur Golding's Ovid's Metamorphoses, he was a very loose translator. He added things and so forth, but Marlowe follows the text. The poem is rendered in rhyme couplets. That's something that Shakespeare tends to avoid when he's going on a long poem. Critical appraisal is not very high. The translation is, quote, characterized by metrical inexperience and defective scholarship. That's not something you usually hear about de Vere's work. Copies of one edition were publicly burned in 1599 by order of the Archbishop of Canterbury. That is the same Archbishop who personally signed off on Venus and Adonis. It's not likely that he would have banned a book if Oxford wrote it. So we can leave that in the Marlowe Canon perfectly well. His other translation is Lucan's first book. This is a blank verse translation of Marcus Lucanus' Pharsalia. The subtitle is interesting. It's translated line for line by Christopher Marlowe. So again, he closely follows the original. Critical appraisal is also not very high. Quote, erroneous renderings abound on every page. That's not something you'd likely see for an Oxford translation. And the topic and style are up the boisterous alley that would make Marlowe famous. Romans, what madness, what huge lust of war hath made barbarians drunk with Latin blood. That's kind of classic Marlowe there. So we can leave those in the Marlowe canon. Let's look at his 2 Latin addresses. One was to Mary Countess of Pembroke, signed C.M. This appeared in Thomas Watson's Amenti Gaudia. Well, Marlowe was friendly with Watson. In 1589, Watson came to his defense in a street fight. It has the muscular phrases typical of Marlowe, so there's everything pointing to Marlowe there. The second one is called Epitaph for Roger Manwood, also in 1592. Well, Manwood happens to be one of the jurists who decided in favor of Watson and Marlowe's innocence in the street fight. And he had died that year, so that fits Marlowe perfectly as well. No reason to suspect anybody but him. He was involved. Okay, let's look at his 2 poems. One is called Description of Seas, Waters, Rivers, etc. It's just a fragment. We don't have the whole thing. It appeared in England's Parnassus in 1600 and is noted to be by Christopher Marlowe. And again, it's direct. It doesn't have ornamentation. It's perfectly good as a Marlowe poem. The other one, of course, is more famous, his unfinished Hero and Leander. He was killed before he could finish it. And like his previous work, All Ovid's Elegies, it's rendered in rhymed couplets. He seemed to like that approach. It's also got what I would call some immature lines. Here's an example. Many would praise the sweet smell as she passed, when 'twas the odor which her breath forth cast. That's not Shakespearean. It does get better. Many critics absolutely love this. And as Bullen pointed out, the music of Marlowe's rhymed heroics was all his own, and I agree with that. So now we're getting to the plays. And what are we going to find here? Well, let's go through them one by one. Before we talk about each play individually, let's look at some of the traits that people have identified as being Marlowe's as contrasted to Shakespeare's. Marlowe's writing style is aggressive. It's infused with masculine bluster. There's no room for love or mercy, which, of course, were big in Shakespeare's canon. Marlowe lacks thoughtfulness, feelings, and humor, all of which Shakespeare displays. Marlowe sets none of his plays in Italy. Shakespeare sets a third of them there. Marlowe sets 4 plays in the Middle East, Germany, and Malta. Shakespeare never uses those places as main points in his plays. Shakespeare's important characters are royal or noble. Most of Marlowe's are not. Marlowe has an exceptional fondness for using military terms. Now, Oxford knew military terms, but he wasn't overly fond of them. Marlowe celebrates upward thrust and aspiration. Shakespeare did not. He didn't like ambitious people, such as Macbeth. He believed in a social order and that people should stick to it. The 2 playwrights have opposite views of fortune as well. Hamlet disparages the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, and Tamburlaine boasts, "I hold the fates bound fast in iron chains, and with my hand turn fortune's wheel about." So there are many things about them that are quite different. And I find it rather strange that some people think they're the same. And finally, Marlowe, quote, lacked his rival's effortless ability to turn an unforgettable phrase. One person said Charles Lamb thought it a titanic task to cull even a few worthwhile lines from Marlowe's Tamburlaine. And I can attest to that as well. All right, so let's start with Tamburlaine and Tamburlaine the Great Part 2. I've actually seen them recently. They're actually dramatic and fun to watch. But within just a few pages, I knew that Oxford did not write Tamburlaine. It has all the traits of Marlowe's writing as contrasted to Shakespeare's, the one we just went through. Same is true of Tamburlaine Part 2 and most of the rest of the Marlowe Canon. The sources for Tamburlaine pretty much differ from Shakespeare. Here's a list of the sources he used. I don't recognize any of them as Shakespearean. Some of you might. But for the most part, he went to his own books for source. Okay, the next one we're going to look at is The Jew of Malta. This play begins with a monologue by Machiavelli, not one of Shakespeare's favorite people. The opening line, I would say, to my sense, is awkward. This is the opening line of the play now. So that of thus much, that return was made. That's a far cry from If Music Be the Food of Love, play on. The expletive is there, but it's not in Shakespeare. And Marlowe's mighty lines do erupt on occasion. For example, why let 'em come so they come not to war, or let 'em war so we be conquerors. Nay, let 'em combat, conquer, and kill all. That's pretty classic Marlowe. Now let's look at a critical appraisal. It's going to be in the same vein as the other ones. In contrast to Shakespeare's Shylock, quote, Barabbas is pretty much the type of one-dimensional stock Jewish villain that one would expect from an Elizabethan playwright. That comment is from our own Earl Showerman. So that is not something we're going to look at and say, gee, that sounds like the Earl of Oxford to me. What about the Massacre at Paris? Well, the available text for this play is corrupted on nearly every page. And that right there sets it apart from Shakespeare plays, which are really well edited and maintained. Many lines are inserted from other plays, so scholars think the text was compiled from memory by an acting company. Nevertheless, quote, throughout the play to the very end occur lines of the most characteristically Marlovian quality. The theme is anti-Catholic. In Shakespeare's plays, friars are helpful. In Marlowe's play, a friar stabs the King of France. And again, let's look at a critical appraisal. Quote, of the Massacre at Paris, it is unnecessary to say much. So we're getting a feel for the kind of things Marlowe's writing and also the kind of reaction that the critics have. Now I'm going to talk about 3 plays in the Marlowe Canon that I believe Oxford was involved in producing. Now this is a play, as I say here, that stopped me in my tracks. Within 5 minutes, I knew I was reading a Shakespeare play. And I couldn't believe it after all those centuries that nobody else, to my knowledge, felt the same way. And Brooke wrote, quote, Marlowe's authorship of Edward II is stated on all the early title pages and has never been questioned. Now that was true when he said that, but it became false a few years later. Guess who figured that out? Well, the Ogburns did. Now, they didn't get everything right, but I know they got this right. They tagged, quote, the greater part of Edward II as Oxford. Dorothy Ogburn offered evidence that Edward II is a direct forerunner of Henry IV and of Richard II and is by the same hand. Charlton Ogburn supposed the play was an early one of Oxford's that the Earl turned over in draft to Marlowe to make what he could of it. Now, I don't think that's the case. I don't think it's an early play. I think Oxford wrote the entire play, and I think Marlowe never laid eyes on it, much less a finger. The play is absolutely packed with Shakespearean attributes, and if you read it yourself, I know you'll come to the same conclusion. This is the only play that Marlowe, in the Marlowe Canon, that's set in England. It tells the story of an English king, a topic Shakespeare treats 11 times. The title begins The Troublesome Reign. Does that sound familiar? That's like the Shakespeare title, The Troublesome Reign of John. A major source of Edward II is Holinshed's Chronicles. That's one of Shakespeare's primary sources. Edward II also draws from Ovid's Metamorphoses. We've heard that before, Shakespeare's favorite source. Quote, there are in Edward II a number of parallels with lines in early Shakespeare plays. Richard Rowland linked numerous terms in Edward II to 24 Shakespeare plays. So these are people who believe Marlowe wrote it, but they keep showing how close it is to Shakespeare. And I'll just give you a little taste of the waterfall of Shakespearean passages that occur throughout the play. These are not meant for me. I must have wanton poets, pleasant wits, musicians, that with touching of a string may draw the pliant king which way I please. Oh, that mine arms could close this isle about, that I might pull him to me where I would, or that these tears that drizzle from mine eyes had power to mollify his stony heart. Inhumane creatures nursed with tiger's milk. Then comes sweet death and rid me of this grief. Marlowe never wrote a line like that. Scholars state that Edward II is unique in the Marlowe Canon. Now listen to these comments. Quote, there seems little enough development between Tamburlaine and Dr. Faustus. Now these are plays that he started with and the year he died, Dr. Faustus. But Edward II, in almost every aspect of its dramaturgy, is unlike any other play by Marlowe. Edward II would prove Marlowe's ability to challenge his own assumptions, which he'd carried his whole life, to see him reverse himself. So this is the anti-Marlowe. James Shapiro wrote, at the outset at least, I don't know why he stopped there, Marlowe is writing a lot like Shakespeare, not only in the historical and political point of view, but also in the verse style. You got the politics, you got the historical point of view, you got the verse style. They're all Shakespearean, they're saying. And some people decided Edward II is more Shakespearean than Shakespeare. Wells and Taylor found an even greater conformity between function word use in Shakespeare's canonical plays and that in Marlowe's Edward II than they did in many plays accepted as Shakespeare's. So, do scholars conclude the play is Shakespeare's? Hell no. Quote, it is the textbook from which Shakespeare undoubtedly learned many lessons of dramatic art later used in Richard II and Henry IV. Now, we've read that variations of that 1,000 times. Shakespeare's always stealing from somebody and borrowing from somebody and cribbing from somebody. Quote, this is the book with which Shakespeare went to school. Little Shakespeare was learning from this one. Only 5 years had elapsed since Tamburlaine, but there is here a development as impressive as Shakespeare's was to be. Now let's look at the critical appraisal. Remember all the appraisals of everything else we looked at. Edward II is not only Marlowe's best play, it is singularly excellent. Quote, the critics combine in a chorus of approbation when they come to speak of Edward II, which is recognized by common consent as, after Shakespeare's, the finest specimen of the English historical drama, that one play. Quote, it is formally the most finished and satisfactory of Marlowe's plays, evidently carefully written. It is the maturest of Marlowe's plays. It is the best preserved of the poet's tragedies, I think for good reason, and the most perfect in all matters of technical skill. They wrote nothing close to those sentences about anything else that we've covered already from Marlowe. I think there are reasons why Marlowe would not have written it. Scholars see Marlowe's reputed homosexuality as a reason why he wrote about a gay king. But I think it's really a contrary indication. Of course, it was a serious crime at the time. Marlowe would have been wary of advertising his sexual orientation. But to me, much more important, the king in the play is not a hero. He's a bumbler. He suffers an ignominious death, and I think that would have been anathema to the sensibilities of any gay writer. So why would Oxford have attributed the play to Marlowe? Well, his title character was gay. He probably figured, yeah, it works. And number two, Marlowe conveniently died on May the 30th, and the play was registered 5 weeks later on July the 6th. So Marlowe was dead and gone. I don't know if Oxford composed it in 5 weeks. I think he could have, but he might have had it sitting in the can. We just don't know. Now, Edward II also fits into a continuum of kings and plays. England's kings progressed as follows: Edward I, II, and III, Richard II, Henry IV, V, and VI. Shakespeare, as we know, covered the latter four. In other words, the plays that came out in Shakespeare's name covered the latter four kings. What about the first three? Records indicate 3 authors of the Edward plays. George Peele's name is on Edward I, Christopher Marlowe's is on Edward II, Edward III came out as anonymous. Well, I think Oxford wrote them all, and as you know, Edward III has finally been accepted into the Shakespeare canon. Thankfully, it's anonymous. If it had had Fred Smith's name on it, they never would have considered it. Now, I think we've shown, at least a good case, that Edward II was written by Oxford as well, and he put Christopher Marlowe's name on it. Now, I think he also wrote George Peele's Edward I. It's a very cool and fun play. Some people don't think it's done very well. I think it's brilliant in at least one way, and that's thematically. But we won't have time to talk about it. But anyway, I think the plays and the kings all fit what Oxford was doing and absolutely do not fit what Marlowe was doing. Okay, now we're going to go and turn and look at Dido, Queen of Carthage. Now, the title page tells us 2 people were involved. It says it was written by Christopher Marlowe and Thomas Nash, Gent. Why are 2 authors listed? Because there are 2 authors. Some critics argue that this must be Marlowe's first play, written jointly with his Cambridge pal, Thomas Nash, in their overlapping Cambridge days of late 1582 to early 1584. But Nash's first publication was dated in 1589, 5 years later, and this is a very mature play. The play's composition, I think, is too mature for a pair of college students. As with Edward II, Dido has features unique, aside from Edward II, in the Marlowe Canon. And here are some quotes from Orthodox scholars. It is curious, it's always curious, and they tend to stop there, that Marlowe, who had avoided exaggerated alliteration, can in Dido repeatedly write alliterative lines. Quote, for once, Marlowe seems to have descended from his fiery flight above the clouds and to have sought repose in a trim garden plot. Instead of daring imagination, we have quaint conceits and dainty play of fancy, kind of like Midsummer Night's Dream. Instead of Marlowe's utter and striking lack of humor, as scholars have called it, in Dido, Marlowe exploits to the full the comedy of the situation, as we know Oxford did time and again. Marlowe also gave women short shrift. Take a look at Tamburlaine, you'll see what I mean. But Dido sympathetically portrays 3 women. Most critics say Nash had little or nothing to do with Dido, and why do they say that? They say that because, well, Nash was writing satirical pamphlets and criticism, and that doesn't fit. This romantic play doesn't seem to fit the guy. Well, Alexander Grosart took the time to look at the text carefully. He alone, as far as I know, discerned that Nash's contributions, in fact, dominate the play. He wrote, I would state that the vocabulary and phrasing of Nash are so marked in the tragedy, as our glossarial index demonstrates, that of Marlowe is so slightly illustrated that, in my judgment, very little of it was Marlowe's. So good for Grosart. I think he was right about that. My assessment, having read it, is that Act 1 and 2 are Marlowe's. Here you find Marlowe's direct approach to action and dialogue, permeating the first two acts. There are flashes of his mighty line, as in Venus angry addressed to Jove. Juno, false Juno, and her chariot's pomp, drawn through the heavens by steeds of Boreas' brood, made Hebe to direct her airy wheels, etc., etc. As with all Ovid's elegies and Lucan's first book, Aeneas' monologue in Act 2 follows the source text. So here we've got Marlowe doing his thing, as he was doing before in the things we reviewed earlier. Acts 3 through 5, everything changes right at the beginning of Act 3. Now, I think Acts 3 through 5 are by the Earl of Oxford posing as not Thomas Nash and writing like Shakespeare, and that's what's confused scholars. I've got an article in the current Oxfordian explaining some of the reasons why I think Nash is a voice of Oxford's, a pen name of Oxford's. You don't have to accept that. If you want to say, well, Nash was there and Shakespeare was there with him, that's fine. I think it's going to be tough to defend, but that's okay with me. In Act 3, Dido, in my view and many other people's views, becomes a Shakespeare play. This is from Dido's rapturous soliloquy. I'll make me bracelets of his golden hair. His glistening eyes shall be my looking glass, his lips an altar, where I'll offer up as many kisses as the sea hath sands. Notice the secular use of a religious term. Shakespeare does that over and over again. Roland linked terms in the final 3 acts of Dido, not the first 2, to Shakespeare. In the first 2, he couldn't find any. From Act 3 onward, the play stops adhering to the source text. Quote, Marlowe made several additions to the Virgilian narrative, starting in Act 3. The principal being, now listen to these. These are what was added to the Virgilian narrative. A framing induction. Where have we seen that? Taming of the Shrew. A comic nurse. Where have we seen that? Romeo and Juliet. And multiple suicides at the close. Well, there's Antony Cleopatra, Romeo and Juliet. This is Oxford. This is not how Marlowe ends his plays. A.W. Ward noted that Dido's review of her suitors is very like Portia's in The Merchant of Venice. And, quote, the closing line of Dido falls on the ear like the last line of Juliet's speech after drinking the potion. Quote, Marlowe's nurse always makes me think of the nurse in Romeo and Juliet. The play includes the word interchangeably, which scholars have identified as legal language, and precisely the term used for the indenture in Shakespeare's 1 Henry IV. Marlowe was not a lawyer. Dido draws upon books 2 and 4 of Virgil's Aeneid. These are also the books Shakespeare cites more often. Isn't that interesting? And do we know why that happened? Yes, we do, because Oxford's uncle, the Earl of Surrey, translated, guess what, books 2 and 4 of Virgil's Aeneid. So over and over, it's pointing to Shakespeare and Oxford. Scholars identify Shakespeare's presence in dozens of ways. So when I said earlier, I can't believe nobody notices Shakespeare, actually, many people noticed it's Shakespeare. They just couldn't bring themselves to say that it was Shakespeare. So here's what we get. Quote, the mixed farce and romance, that's an amazing quote, of Dido, Queen of Carthage, is Marlowe's most significant gift to Shakespeare. I think there are 4 reasons why scholars are confused. Marlowe and Nash's names are on the cover. But Marlowe never wrote anything like this, like the last 3 acts anyway. Nash never wrote a history play or a love story, so that didn't seem to fit. Numerous plot elements, sentiments, and passages sound just like Shakespeare. You can see why this is all so confusing. I think if the names on the title page were Christopher Marlowe and William Shakespeare, generations of readers would know exactly what happened. They would have already figured out where the split was. So to me, the scenario is clear. Marlowe finished Act 2 and he died. Oxford completed the play and put Nash's name on it. Now, why do I think Oxford chose the name Thomas Nash to appear as a co-author? Well, because in mid-1593, Robert Greene was, quote-unquote, dead. You know, he retired that voice, although the spirit of Robert Greene kept popping up and producing things. That was kind of strange. Shakespeare was not a name yet. He was not a published playwright. The first play by Shakespeare didn't come out till 1598, 5 years later. And Thomas Nash was at that time his most successful entity. And here, I think, is a big clue to why he wanted to put that name on the play. In Strange News of the same year, Nash declared his eagerness to prove that if anyone will challenge me to whatsoever quiet adventure of art, he shall find that I am a scholar in something else but contention. In other words, Oxford was using him for a voice of contention, but he said, look, this isn't all I am. I can do whatever you ask. So he was asking his literary buddies, hey, come out in print and ask me to do something and I'll do it. And this was his chance to put a name on something and say, well, look, Thomas Nash can write a romantic play better as well as anybody. And now we get to critical appraisal. One critic called Dido perhaps Marlowe's best piece of total theater. I really enjoyed the play. I recommend it. So now we're going to skip to the last one under consideration. This is Dr. Faustus. It was written around 1588, registered 1600, published 1604. Now, Dr. Faustus is a Marlowe play. It runs along Christian lines in dramatizing a battle between the promise of heaven and the pleasures of earth for a man's soul. None of Shakespeare's plays or poems treats such a theme, at least not overtly. Scholars have noted textual connections to Tamburlaine, Tamburlaine Part 2, The Massacre at Paris, and Lucan's first book, all of which we've identified as definitely Marlowe's. Scholars have determined this, so this isn't my idea. Someone else contributed the prose portions after Marlowe died. Well, who did it? The prose portions provide the play's humor. They feature a clown. Now, this is really important because in the opening lines of Tamburlaine, Marlowe disparages the very idea of clowns in plays. He was challenging Oxford, really, as the guy who kept showing fools and clowns in his plays, and he was saying, these are stupid. You're not going to find one of these in my plays. And suddenly in Faustus, he's got a clown. Paul Kocher cited dozens of prose lines from Faustus that resound, quote, throughout the length and breadth of Thomas Nash's works. He identified Nash's presence from the community of ideas, style, and tone, which they have with his acknowledged works. This was in 1942. I'll give you just one of his examples because some of them link to Shakespeare as well, which doesn't surprise me. Dr. Faustus says, I'll turn all the lice about thee into familiars. Thomas Nash wrote, the Druids are reported to have been lousy with familiars. Well, Shakespeare in The Merry Wives says, louses are a familiar beast to man. So I still think it's one editor there, not two. I think Shakespeare Nash equal Oxford. Well, Oxford expanded to verse portions as well. Darren Charlton observed the opening four lines spoken by the Lord in the induction of the anonymous The Taming of a Shrew are identical to the words spoken by Faustus. Well, how'd that happen? Here are the four lines. I'm not going to read them, but you can see they're almost identical. Well, the lines are also obviously inserted because they appear between the stage direction, enter Faustus, and what were surely Marlowe's opening lines for him, Faustus, begin thine incantations. So he stuck it in there in the middle. Now, why would Oxford reuse this text? I think it's because he deleted it from his later version of The Taming of the Shrew and said, these are awesome lines. And I didn't use them again. Oh, I got a good place for them. I'll slip them right here at the beginning of Faustus. Kocher concluded, Marlowe wrote a fairly short play. I'd love to have the original, but unfortunately I think Oxford got involved in the verse as well. Almost wholly in serious verse, as were his other plays. Since by 1594 it had grown somewhat stale, Nash was employed to freshen it up and insert comedy. He did so probably in the summer of 1594 in preparation for Henslow's revival of the play in autumn of that year. Now, I think this review, at least to me, makes it clear what happened to the Marlowe Canon. After Marlowe's death, Oxford wrote Edward II, he finished Dido, and he expanded Dr. Faustus. So he was not a voice of the Earl of Oxford. I don't think Christopher Marlowe would have ever allowed him to put a play in his name. He felt so different. But once he was dead, that's a different story. Now Oxford could do what he wanted. To test my idea, I made a list of 52 notable words found in Shakespeare. I had my assistant count the instances in all 7 Marlowe plays in Hero and Leander. Now, these are the words I used and the number of times you find them in Shakespeare. And here's what we found. The total instances of these Shakespeare words, 162 of them appear in Edward II. There are 114 instances in Dido, whereas Marlowe's true canon, or the rest of it, averaged 79. I think that's precisely the result we would expect if Oxford wrote Edward II and co-wrote Dido. So, whole new question here. Did Marlowe contribute to the Shakespeare canon? Because there's a whole lot of literature about that. I don't think he did at all. I think he was completely independent until he died. Oxford's contributions to 3 plays in Marlowe's name, however, corrupt any studies purporting to find Marlovian text in Shakespeare's plays. A proper test requires excluding Oxford's contributions to get down to what Marlowe wrote himself. So here's what I think is the canon of Christopher Marlowe, properly attributed. On the left, we have the things that are 100% Marlowe. On the right, we have the one item that's 100% Oxford. And of course, all 3 items involved, and the 2 with dual authorship, occurred after Marlowe died. So you can find more details if you're interested in Oxford's voices. I have a long chapter on Christopher Marlowe. I saved it to near the end of my work because I did not want to find that he was a voice. And I got all the way up to Edward II saying, this is great, he's going to be independent. Well, he was independent, except for that one big play that Oxford put in his name. Now, I'm just going to add a little PS here that I found personally kind of interesting. In the latest Oxfordian, if you read it very carefully, you'll find that 2 Oxfordians identified people that I tagged as voices. William Niederkorn identifies the printer Thomas Newman as a voice for 3 pamphlet dedications. If you want to see what they are, you can either read his article or go to my Thomas Newman chapter. Cheryl Egan Donovan noted that Michael Delahoyd speculated last year that Thomas Weeks is a voice for 2 sets of madrigals that were published in 1597, 1598. He said, these are Oxford's texts, I can tell. Well, I certainly agreed with that because there's a section called Songwriters in my book, and the Thomas Wilkes is one of those voices that is listed. And the final comment I'm going to make, which I just put in today, you saw Daniel Cowan's presentation on Friday, right? He talked about Edward de Vere and the art of memory. Well, you might be interested to know that in 1562, a book came out called The Castle of Memory. He was talking about the Palace of Memory, right? Well, this book is called The Castle of Memory. It's a translation of a book that was printed in Italy in 1553. I think Oxford probably read it while he was with Thomas Smith and adopted the approach and wrote the translation. There are a lot of connections to Shakespeare there. The name on the book is William Fullwood. Well, who was he? Well, he was a local merchant. There are 5 other books in his name in the 1560s. I don't think he wrote a single one of them. I don't think he ever wrote a book in his life. They all have connections to Oxford's voices, Shakespeare, and Oxford himself. So if you're at all curious, you might want to check out the William Fullwood chapter as well. So thanks very much for your time. I know we're cutting short, so I'm going to run. If you have any questions, I'll be here